we are now delighted to welcome an American political scientist, activist, and expert on the politics of the Holocaust, longtime critic of Israel, and one of the most prominent voices in the debate around Israel and its war on Palestine. He has written many books on the subject, most recent of which is I'll Burn That Bridge When I Get to It, focused on cancel culture.
But I think more than all of that, my brothers and my sisters, every single one of us has prayed, has wept, and has marched for Palestine. But few of us have sacrificed everything, have sacrificed their well-being, their personal well-being, have sacrificed their careers for the liberation of Palestine. So I want you all to stand up right now, and put your hands together. Stand up right now, put your hands together, and welcome onto the stage Professor Norman Finkelstein. Woo!
Well, thank you for having me. And time is short, so I want to try to use it as productively and effectively as I can. More than a year has passed since the events of October 7th, but it seems that two questions, even a year later, keep coming up, keep being repeated, and it's perhaps fair to say those two questions haven't had an entirely satisfactory response, or at any rate, most people, when those questions are posed, don't quite know how to answer them. And I would add, I believe those questions are difficult to answer. You might call them the Pierce-Morgan questions. The first one is, do you condemn what Hamas did on October 7th? If you don't condemn Hamas, you are no longer part of the conversation. But if you do condemn Hamas, something inside you tells you that you've given more ground than ought to be given. You've conceded too much. So how does one answer that question? I believe the correct way to answer the question, do you condemn what Hamas did, is by reformulating the question. Namely, what should Hamas have done? And there, I think, we get to the heart of the moral dilemma. First of all, what was Gaza on October 6th, the night before that fateful day? As most of you know, the two basic facts about Gaza are, number one, it's overwhelmingly a refugee population. 80% of the people living in Gaza were either refugees from 1948, the first Arab-Israeli war, or the children, the descendants of the refugees. Number two, the second basic fact. One, Gaza is overwhelmingly a refugee population. 2, Gaza is in half its part a child population. Whenever you hear about artillery being fired, missiles being launched, 2,000-pound bombs being dropped, bear in mind, half of the targets, 1/2, are children. Gaza is overwhelmingly a refugee population and 1/2 a child population. Time doesn't allow to describe in detail what life looked like in Gaza on October 6th. But one image keeps springing to mind when anyone visits Gaza. So, the main UN official working in Gaza, this was when Gaza was under Egyptian administrative detention, 1955. The main UN official there is a fellow named E.L.M. Burns, and he has to describe Gaza. How does he describe it? He said, Gaza resembles a concentration camp. Right after the June 1967 war, the father of our well-known Senator Al Gore, who ran for president at a certain point, his father visited Gaza. And in a speech, how did he describe Gaza? He said, Gaza is a concentration camp. In 2004, the head of Israel's National Security Council, his name is Giora Eiland, E-I-L-A-N-D, he had to describe Gaza. Now, Mr. Eiland is not a peacenik. He's not a liberal. Mr. Eiland is the individual who in more recent months has been advocating the spreading of epidemics in Gaza to achieve Israel's aims. So he's not exactly what you would call a nice guy. How did he describe Gaza? In March 2004, he described Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp. One of Israel's senior sociologists at the Hebrew University, he wrote a little book, and he had to describe Gaza. He described Gaza as the biggest concentration camp ever to exist. Israel's most authoritative journalist on Gaza is a woman named Amira Haas. And once she had to confront the question, and it was a personal question for her, because her parents passed through the Nazi Holocaust. And she had to describe, or she was asked the question, how would you describe Gaza? She said, it's a concentration camp. So, on October 7th, a large portion of that population, a large portion, had been born into a concentration camp. From the first day of their birth to the last breath of their life, they were confined in a concentration camp. But it wasn't just a concentration camp, because periodically Israel went into Gaza to what it called mow the lawn in Gaza. What was mowing the lawn? Be it 2008-9 Operation Cast Lead, be it 2012 Operation Pillar of Defense, be it 2014 Operation Protective Edge. Every few years, Israel went into, as they call it, mow the lawn in Gaza. What was mowing the lawn? It was these high-tech killing sprees accompanied by massive death and destruction. In Operation Protective Edge, 300 children were killed, 350 children were killed, 6,000 homes destroyed. Operation Protective Edge, well, the first one, the first in 2008 was Operation Cast Lead. 2014, Operation Protective Edge, 550 children killed, 18,000 homes destroyed. That was Gaza, the biggest concentration camp ever to exist, which periodically became the object of one of Israel's high-tech killing sprees. But it might be said the people of Gaza had it coming because Hamas was a terrorist organization. What does the record show? The record shows that after Hamas won the election that incidentally was imposed on the people of Gaza by the U.S. administration of George Bush, once they won the election, the record shows that they made many attempts to try to resolve this conflict with Israel diplomatically. They made it relatively clear that they were prepared for a two-state settlement in accordance with international law and UN resolutions. That was rejected by Israel and the so-called Western democracies. Hamas then attempted nonviolent civil resistance beginning on March 30th, 2018. What was the response to what was called the Great March of Return? The attempt at nonviolent civil resistance? The answer is very clear. It comes to us courtesy of an exhaustive UN investigation. Israel lined up along the perimeter fence its best snipers, its most talented snipers. And who did they target? Well, the UN report said they targeted children, they targeted journalists, they targeted medics, and in a testament to the character of that country and the countries that support it, including the UK, they targeted people with disabilities. They targeted double amputees. According to the UN report, these people who were targeted were between 100 and 300 meters from the fence separating Gaza from Israel. And they posed no threat whatsoever when they were gunned down. Well, you live in a concentration camp that's periodically subject to high-tech killing sprees. You try a diplomatic resolution of the conflict, it's ignored. You try nonviolent civil resistance, it's ignored. So you have really two choices. One, to be born into, to languish in, and to die in a concentration camp, or to resist. Now, it's a fair question in my opinion, but when they resisted the people of Hamas and the other resistance groups, why did they have to target civilians? I do believe, because we have to stick to the facts, we should never deviate from the truth. I believe that the record is clear that at least one component of the events of October 7th was to commit a civilian massacre. Exactly the magnitude that they were committed to, I think it's still a little bit gray, but it's simply undeniable that one aspect of October 7th was to commit a civilian massacre and also to take hostages. I would say the following. Let's, for example, play a little mind game. Let's say Hamas had killed, the numbers now stand at roughly, about 850 civilians were killed, 350 military personnel were killed, the rough numbers. Let's say instead of 850 civilians, Hamas had killed, all told, 1,200 soldiers. For argument's sake, let's say they killed 1,200 soldiers instead of 350 soldiers and 850 civilians. Is it conceivable that Israel's reaction would have been any less murderous if instead of killing civilians, it was all soldiers that were killed? And when Israel sought to exact revenge, can anyone possibly believe that Israel's revenge would have been less because it was soldiers or combatants who were targeted and not civilians? I believe the answer is clearly no. It made no difference from Israel's vantage point whether civilians or soldiers were killed. They were going to exact their revenge. But there's still another question. Would it have made any difference in public opinion if it were only soldiers who were targeted? I would say the states, the UK, the US, France, Germany, at the state level, it would have made no difference, but at a people level, it may have made a difference. The members of Hamas made a decision. They wanted to communicate the message, transmit the message to Israel that so long as our civilians are not safe, your civilians are not safe. I would say, if you look at the history of the slave revolts, in which many civilians were targeted and killed, be it in the United States or in the Caribbean, I can only say the following. That if you take the case of the United States, which I know better, there were slave revolts. The slave revolts targeted civilians, men, women, children, and those who led those slave revolts, now, I'm talking about the 21st and also the 20th century, now they occupy an honored place in our, meaning American history, because there is a recognition that however horrible the deeds were in the slave revolt, it nonetheless was an expression of a humanity that was being tortured and denied any future. And when you want to weigh the moral scale, the first, and in my opinion, the first primary consideration has to be that, be it a Nat Turner in the United States or a Hamas militant in Gaza, on October 6th, they faced the prospect of no past, no present, no future. And they would not reconcile themselves to that reality. Now, the second question is, the Pierce Morgan question number 2, is what should Israel have done? The attack happened. What should Israel have done? And that effectively is asking the question, doesn't Israel have the right to self-defense? Again, it's not an easy question to answer. And I had to reflect on it at some length. The first thing I would say is the following. Let's take a very modest level of Gaza, a small level, a level that everybody in the audience understands from their own earthly existence. Let's take the case of a woman who is mercilessly battered by her husband. Day in and day out, she's being battered by her merciless spouse. She lets out screams and yells and pleads for help, but all of her pleas are ignored. She then summons the courage to call the police. The police come to her home and they say, sorry, This is a domestic dispute. We can't get involved. She tried to reach her neighbors. They ignored her. She tried to call on the law. She was ignored. And then one day, when her spouse is about to beat her again, she takes a knife and she stabs him. And then she stabs him twice. She stabs him 3 times. She stabs him 4 and 5 times. He reaches for a gun and he shoots her dead. Now, you will probably know that if he went to court, he would claim the right to self-defense, and he probably would win in court. In fact, he almost certainly would win in court. But then you have to ask yourself the moral question. Did he have the right to kill her? He said it was self-defense. He said she stabbed me 5 times. But you have to ask yourself, or we all have to ask ourselves, did he, from a moral point of view, have the right to kill her? Which is my way of saying, I believe after what Israel had inflicted on the people of Gaza for decades on end, they had forfeited their right to self-defense. But there's a second aspect, because saying Israel had the right to self-defense presumes they were engaging in a war of self-defense. Now, it's true that formally, in public, Israel announced they had 2 main goals: to defeat Hamas and to get the hostages returned. But if you look at the actual record, it's quite clear those were not Israel's goals. That's what Israel said were its goals. What were its real goals? Number 1, it was retribution. It was vengeance. It was exacting revenge on those subhumans, those Untermenschen, as the Nazis called them. It was exacting revenge on the Untermenschen because those subhumans in Gaza had dared to defy the Übermenschen, the supermen, as the Nazis called them. Number 2, the goal was to restore the Arab world's fear of Israel. Israel was concerned, as was the United States, that after October 7th, too many Arabs, too many Muslims would begin to think, hey, Israel is not as strong as we thought it was. Hey, Israel is not militarily invincible. Hey, maybe there is a military option against Israel. So Israel had to remind the Arab world, the Muslim world, that we are as strong as we ever were. And how does Israel remind them, meaning the Arab Muslim world, by committing death and destruction on so massive a scale that everybody else in the region would fear Israel and not dare raise their heads. And the last goal, the most important goal for Israel, it wasn't the hostages, it wasn't defeating Hamas. The main goal was to once and for all solve the Gaza question, to put an end to the Gaza question. And it therefore, it embarked on a genocide. Now, first of all, a credible case has been made before the International Court of Justice by South Africa that Israel is committing genocide. And you simply have to look at the facts. Ask yourself a simple question, very simple question. If this was a war of self-defense, why was Israel systematically targeting Gaza's hospitals? 20 of the 36 hospitals in Gaza are gone. They have been vaporized. About 4 can be said to still be operative. If this was a war of self-defense, why was Israel targeting every university in Gaza? If this was a war of self-defense, why is it that Israel directed the population of Gaza to what it called safe areas, and when the population reached the safe areas, Israel dropped 2,000-pound bombs on the safe areas? Does that sound like a war of self-defense, or does it sound like a genocide? If this was a war of self-defense, then why is it that unprecedented numbers of journalists were killed? Why is it that unprecedented numbers of medics were killed? Why is it that unprecedented numbers of UN workers were killed? When Israel and its supporters ask the question, what should Israel have done? And doesn't Israel have the right to self-defense? The real question that's being asked is, the real question based on the facts, the real question that's being asked is, does Israel have the right, not to self-defense, but does Israel have the right to commit genocide in Gaza? So whenever you are asked, well, doesn't Israel have the right to self-defense? Your reply should be, excuse me, that's not self-defense. That's a unmitigated genocide. And that will bring me to one last point, and it's the question of Hezbollah, the party of God. Now, Hezbollah, once the genocide began, started firing rockets at northern Israel. And people were outraged at Hezbollah's audacity, because they had no stake in this. This was between Israel and Hamas. Why are they getting involved? Well, in the early 2000s, all the Western liberals developed this doctrine. It was called R2P, responsibility to protect. And responsibility to protect meant that when the international institutions fail humanity, they fail to stop a genocide, then individual states on their own, when the international community fails to stop a genocide, they have their own responsibility to protect, R2P. And it's simply a fact that the Party of God, Hezbollah, the Houthis in Yemen, they rose to the occasion. Whatever you might think of their politics, they rose to the occasion and they rose to their responsibility to protect the people of Gaza from a genocide that was being inflicted on them. Thank you.